This is a recording of Chapter 4 for Environmental Sustainability. The chapter is about evolution and biodiversity and the vulnerability to extinctions of certain animals and plants. What is biodiversity? Also called biological diversity, it is the extensive variety of life on Earth. There is a great variety of species on Earth with a rich variety of genetic information that they contain, ecosystems they inhabit, and ecosystem processes such as nutrient cycling and photosynthesis that they are involved in. Biodiversity helps to sustain all life on Earth. A biodiversity hotspot is an area on Earth that has high levels of biodiversity. In other words, they are full of different types of organisms. For example, a tropical rainforest or a coral reef. Biodiversity hotspots can be particularly vulnerable to harmful effects of human activities. This is because there is such a concentration of organisms within that hotspot. For example, a rainforest is vulnerable to being destroyed by deforestation. Many species would then be affected if a lot of trees were cut down or set fire to clear the forest so that you have land for farming or ranching or for creating settlements. You lose many, many, many different types of species in that case. In contrast, a desert, which does not have that many organisms, would not really be that prone to a lot of extinctions or deaths of organisms because they already have so few organisms. If you were, let's say, to have a fire in a desert or some other type of destruction to that type of ecosystem. This map shows biodiversity hotspots around the world, and you could see they cover small fractions of the Earth's surface, but they are home to very, very many different types of species. So the purple and the red are different biological hotspots, biodiversity hotspots. So what is a species? A species is a set of organisms that can mate and produce fertile offspring. An organism is a member of a particular species. So an interesting fact is when a donkey and a horse breed together, they can have offspring. Their offspring is called a mule. However, a mule is not a species because mules are infertile. They are sterile and are unable to produce mules themselves. So you cannot have two mules two mules cannot mate to come up with offspring of another mule. It is completely impossible for mules to have any offspring. Therefore, mules are not a species. Species diversity is the number and variety of species present in any biological community, and genetic diversity is the variety of genes in a population. Genetic diversity among individuals in a population of species of this particular Caribbean snail is reflected in the different colors and the different banding patterns of their shells. The Earth has different types of ecosystems, deserts, grasslands, forests, and different types of forests mountains, oceans, lakes and rivers, and wetlands. For example, the Meadowlands in New Jersey. And the many different types of ecosystems allows for greater diversity of life on Earth as organisms have evolved over time to different types of environments. Land-based or terrestrial portions of the biosphere are classified into what we call biomes. Biomes are large regions with a distinct climate and species, especially vegetation, that are adapted for that climate zone. For example, a desert, a deciduous forest, a tropical rainforest, prairie grasslands. So, what is our local biome? It is a temperate deciduous forest. Deciduous means that the forests contain mostly trees that lose their leaves in autumn. This diagram shows major biomes that are found along the 39th line of latitude across the United States. So if we look all the way to the left, going from the Pacific Ocean towards the east, we start with the coastal mountain ranges, coastal chaparral and scrub. And then we go up the Sierra Nevada mountains and we have coniferous forests. Coniferous means they have pine trees with pine cones. And then you go down the mountain and you hit the Great American Desert, and that is a desert biome. And then you go up the Rocky Mountains, and again, you have coniferous forests with pine trees with pine cones. Coniferous is for like the pine cone. Okay, and then you go into your Great Plains, the Mississippi River Valley, the prairie grassland. And then you get into the Appalachian Mountains with your deciduous forest. And some organisms are well adapted for specific biomes with specific environmental conditions, and this can be explained by natural selection. So we are going to discuss evolution by natural selection. Evolution by natural selection explains how life changes over time. Evolution is how life on Earth changes over time through changes in genes of populations of organisms from one generation to the next. Natural selection is the theory that some individuals in a population have traits that give them a better chance of survival under the existing environmental conditions, and thus a chance to reproduce and pass on that genetic trait. So this would lead to a population with a higher proportion of individuals that possess that particular advantageous trait. Natural selection can lead to changes in the genetic makeup of a population of organisms. Therefore, populations evolve, not individual organisms. And at some point, natural selection can lead to the development of new species. Step one in evolution through natural selection, there needs to be genetic variability among individuals in a population, and this occurs through mutations. Mutations are random changes in the DNA molecules of a gene. An example of genetic variability due to mutations in humans would be red hair. Red hair is caused by a mutation on a particular gene. It can be traced to Central Asia. Mutations can occur in any cell. However, only mutations that occur in genes of reproductive cells, the gametes, the sperm and the egg, can be passed on to offspring. Such mutations, those that occur in the gamete cells, can result in a new trait that can be passed on to further generations. This means it's a heritable trait. Like the term inherited, inheritable, right? So it's a heritable trait. This causes genetic variability among individuals in a population. The second step in evolution through natural selection occurs when environmental conditions favor certain traits over others. In that case, that advantageous trait would be called an adaptation or an adaptive trait. For example, wolves that are born with thicker fur are more likely to survive cold winters than those with thinner fur. So the surviving wolves that have thicker fur will pass on that trait of having thicker fur to their offspring. Another example would be bacteria that is resistant to antibiotics. Here is an example of a favorable advantageous trait. Local squirrels are gray, and they match most of the tree bark that is also in the area. So this becomes excellent camouflage. And then we have genetic resistance of bacteria being resistant to antibiotics. So we start out with a group of bacteria, including a couple of bacteria that are genetically resistant to antibiotics. And then we expose this population to antibiotics. The blue ones are resistant to antibiotics naturally, and the red ones are normal. So then after the population is exposed to antibiotics, most of the normal bacteria die. But the ones that are naturally resistant to antibiotics, just based on their genetics, they happen to be resistant to antibiotics. Those remain and were not killed by the antibiotics. So then they're able to start multiplying and having more and more of the resistant bacteria. So then eventually the population is replaced by a strain of bacteria that are resistant to the antibiotic. So the summary of evolution through natural selection. Random mutations occur in the genes. Individual organisms with adaptive traits are selected when they are able to survive local environmental factors due to advantageous traits. And then they survive and pass on genes to their offspring. And then the populations may evolve to be better adapted to survive under the existing environmental conditions. And then they are able to keep reproducing. There were two limits to adaptation. Environmental changes can only lead to adaptations for traits that are already present in the population's gene pool, or for traits resulting from random mutations. For example, humans cannot all of a sudden become adapted to flying because flying is not a trait in the gene pool. And most likely won't ever become a mutation either. Adaptation is limited to the population's ability to reproduce and pass down beneficial heritable traits. So species that reproduce large quantities of offspring quickly, like fruit flies, can adapt to environmental changes more rapidly than species that reproduce slowly with fewer offspring, like elephants. When environmental conditions change, species face three possible futures. The species can adapt to the new conditions. They can move to an area with more favorable conditions, or they can become extinct. Climate has changed drastically throughout Earth history. For example, we had the ice ages. Some species may become extinct if climate changes too rapidly for them to adapt. New species may evolve that take over their ecological roles. For example, woolly mammoths died off at the end of the Ice Age. They were unable to adapt to warming temperatures. There were different types of extinctions. We have biological extinction. That is when an entire species goes extinct and ceases to exist. A local extinction is when a population of a species is extinct over a large region, but not globally. There is always a very low, constant background extinction rate that is 0.0001% of all species go extinct every year. Mass extinctions are when we have a significant rise in extinction rates above the normal background rate. These are usually due to a catastrophic global event, such as a large meteorite impact. Large groups of species, like 25 to 95% of all species in existence at a particular time, can go extinct during a mass extinction. There have been 5 mass extinctions over Earth history. Mass extinctions usually lead to an increase in species diversity, meaning that there are a lot more different types of species later on. This is as new species develop to exploit the newly available resources due to less competition. So, with a lot of extinctions, you're then left with more land, food, and water that is available with less competition. After the mass extinction 65 million years ago, when the dinosaurs went extinct, mammals replaced reptiles as the dominant vertebrates on land. Before that, there were very few mammals, and the mammals that were in existence were small in size. So the number of different types of mammals increased. And that was to fill in the niches that were left behind by the mass extinction. Evidence suggests that we are experiencing the beginning of a new mass extinction, primarily due to human activities. So this would be the 6th extinction, the 6th mass extinction. The largest cause of extinctions is the loss of habitat. The loss of habitat can result from different things, including clearing forests for farming. For example, destroying different parts of the Amazon rainforest so that you can use the land for farmland. Harvesting fish faster than populations can be replenished by reproduction. And pollution of water, soil, and air. So this new mass extinction, the 6th extinction, is the first time that organisms are leading to the mass extinction of other organisms. Now let's talk about species and speciation. How do new species evolve? Speciation, under certain circumstances, natural selection can lead to the development of new species. The new species can then no longer produce fertile offspring with members of another population that evolved under different conditions. So a species breaks off into two different new species, and then those two new species are unable to produce fertile offspring if they were to come back together and breed. So how do new species evolve? Speciation can be the result of a barrier or distant migration that prevents the flow of genes between separated populations. So there has to be some reason why different groups of a species are separated. And that is the first phase of speciation, geographic isolation. So you divide a population and you continue to separate the different groups. And the second phase of speciation is reproductive isolation. And I have this example of a kangaroo where kangaroos are only found in Australia. Australia is separated from all other land masses. So it is a unique look at speciation when you look at organisms that live in Australia. So when different groups of the same population of species become physically isolated from one another for a long period of time, they have been geographically isolated. This could be due to mountain ranges, streams, roads, tectonic plate movements, and being on separate islands. Tectonic movement is that the Earth's surface is broken into several rigid pieces called tectonic plates, and these tectonic plates move around the Earth and have changed positions over time. About 200 to 250 million years ago, all of the continents were together in a supercontinent called Pangaea. And that began to split apart about 135 million years ago. So that is the main example of when all the continents were together and then they broke apart. So when they broke apart, that would have caused geographic isolation. Geographic isolation can lead to reproductive isolation, the divergence of gene pools, and speciation, the emergence of new species. So here we have an early fox population. So a fox in North America that some of the population moved northward and some of the population moved southward in North America. Now that these two populations were isolated geographically for a long period of time, they lived in different environmental conditions. So this northern population adapted to cold. They grew to be a population of heavier fur. They had short ears, short legs, and a short nose. All of these adaptations are good for living in the cold. And they had white fur to match the snow for camouflage. The southern population got better adapted to heat through having lightweight fur, long ears, long legs, a long nose, all which allow the body to give off more heat and stay cooler. So by the two different populations living in different environmental conditions for so long, it led to two different species. So now we have the Arctic fox and the gray fox. both of which came initially from an earlier fox population of a different species. Reproductive isolation. When mutations and natural selection occur in separate populations and the two separate groups adapt to their local environmental conditions. So that would be the Arctic fox and the gray fox developing into two different species. If enough time elapses, the individuals in the separate populations may become so different that they would no longer be able to reproduce fertile offspring if they rejoined together. So if we just go back, here are these little bugs. They are geographically isolated by this mountain, or in their case, this could just be a hill because they're so small. And then enough time has elapsed, they are unable to mate with each other and have offspring. So no babies for these little buggies. So what role do species play in ecosystems? An important principle of ecology is that each species has a specific role to play in the ecosystem where it is found. And the role that a species plays is its ecological niche. An example of a niche is that a beaver constructs dams in a stream, and that alters the stream and it creates calm marshland habitats, which are helpful to other organisms that live in that calm environment created by the beaver's dam. What role do species play in ecosystems? Classification of niches. So here we have a generalist species that is species that has broad niches, and a specialist species is a species that has a narrow niche. Generalist species are pretty flexible in their requirements. So they can live in many different places, eat a variety of different foods, tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions. For example, flies, cockroaches, mice, rats, white-tailed deer, and humans. These characteristics make generalist species less vulnerable to extinction if habitat conditions change. A specialist species. These species may be able to live in only one type of habitat, eat only one or a few types of food. For example, pandas eat bamboo, koalas eat eucalyptus, or they tolerate a narrow range of climatic environmental conditions. Climatic or environmental conditions. Specialist species are more vulnerable to extinction if environmental conditions change. For example, what would happen to pandas if bamboo populations were to die due to a fungal infection? Some species of shorebirds, giant pandas, and koala bears are specialist species. And here you see the range where giant pandas live is very small. Here we have various shorebirds in a coastal wetland area, and they have different feeding niches. So they live in and feed in very specific parts of a coastal environment. There are four major roles that species can play within their ecosystems. Native species, non-native species may also be invasive, indicator species, and keystone species. Native species are species that normally live in a particular ecosystem. For example, polar bears live in the Arctic Circle region. This is a map of the countries in the northern polar region. Polar bears live along the edges of these countries at the coast. Non-native species are species that migrate into or are deliberately or accidentally introduced into an ecosystem that are not naturally a part of. They're also called alien, invasive, or exotic species. Some non-native species can compete with and reduce native species populations. Often they do not face the same predators or diseases they did in their original habitats, and they end up thriving and can even outcompete native species. One example of a major invasive species is zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are found in many lakes in the United States, particularly the Great Lakes. You can read more information about them down here at this link. Another invasive species is the spotted lanternfly. These are insects that came from Asia, and they are a threat to many species of plants in New Jersey. Residents have been instructed to kill this fly anytime you see them. This is the younger stage, the nymph stage of this insect, and these are what the adults look like. And there's more information down here at this link at the bottom. Then we have indicator species. These are species that provide early warning signs of damage to a community or ecosystem. Birds are indicator species because they are found everywhere and they are affected quickly by environmental changes such as loss of habitat or introduction of chemical pesticides. An example of habitat loss for birds would be trees being cut down. Deforestation. Some amphibians are also indicator species, and this is because they live part of their lives in water and part on land. For example, frogs and salamanders. So they are exposed to water pollution, soil pollution, air pollution, and land pollution. We're going to look more closely at amphibians. Why are amphibians vanishing, particularly frogs? Since 1980, populations of hundreds of the world's almost 6,000 amphibian species have been vanishing or declining in numbers, even in protected wildlife preserves and parks. Many are having difficulty adjusting to rapid environmental changes that have taken place in the air and water and on land during the last few decades. Changes are mostly due to human activities such as pollution, temperature increase, and road salt. The salt that's put on the roads in the winter to help melt the ice. Frogs are especially sensitive and vulnerable to environmental disruption. Frog eggs do not have a shell to protect against UV radiation or pollution. Tadpoles eat aquatic plants and then can be exposed to pesticides and other pollution that might be in the aquatic plants. When adult frogs eat insects, they might be exposed to pesticides. Adult frogs take in water and air through a thin, permeable skin, which can absorb pollutants from the water, oil, or the air or soil. They lack scales to protect them like reptiles have. So their skin is permeable, allowing pollutants to come through. Droughts can dry up small ponds, so that makes them lose areas to lay their eggs. No single cause has been identified in the decline of amphibian populations, but there are factors that have been thought to be involved, such as habitat loss, draining of wetlands, deforestation, farming, and urban development, prolonged droughts, which dry up breeding pools, meaning that less tadpoles will be able to survive, and an increase in UV radiation from the sun related to ozone layer depletion, which can harm eggs and adult amphibians. Parasites like flatworms that feed on eggs in the water, pollution, especially pesticides in bodies of water where the eggs hatch and tadpoles develop, viral and fungal diseases, climate change, and overhunting. These are all thought to be reasons for the declining amphibian numbers. Then we have keystone species. These are species whose roles have a large effect on the types and abundance of other species in an ecosystem. Typically, these are larger predator animals, such as wolves. They usually exist in small numbers within their ecosystem, making them vulnerable to extinction. For example, lions, wolves, some shark species, and the American alligator. Wolves and coyotes help control deer population numbers that makes them keystone species. Alligators dig deep holes which hold fresh water during dry spells. This provides water for other aquatic life. So they help sustain their ecosystems in this way. Another category of species is an endemic species. These are species only found in one area. Endemic species are especially vulnerable to extinction. They may exist on islands, in polar regions, or in tropical rainforests, where most species have highly specialized roles within their ecosystems. For example, polar bears need sea ice to be able to hunt and survive. So they are extremely dependent on the survival of sea ice as global climate keeps on changing. It is unlikely that endemic species can migrate or adapt to changing environmental conditions. Something to think about. Should we worry about every species that is threatened, or should we pick and choose based on their ecological role and contributions to their ecosystems? If you believe that we should pick and choose, how would you choose which species to protect?